The billionaire roared,
You are doing
slamming the heavy
so
mahogany
well.
door against the
I
conservatory
can do
wall as his
this.
voice tore through the
Yes,
grand
look at
corridors
that.
like a physical blow. "Get your hands off my son and get out of my house before I have you arrested for attempted murder." He did not know that he had just interrupted the very miracle he had spent 6
Even
agonizing
Clement,
years and
you don't
$40 million
know.
praying to
You're
witness.
doing what you
Outside, the
different.
freezing November wind howled against the reinforced glass, rattling the French panes that looked out over the private estate in Lake Forest. On the polished limestone floor, Kendra Washington remained on her knees, her dark, calloused hands locked firmly around the trembling waist of 7-year-old Tariq Thornfield. The boy stood suspended between two aluminum forearm crutches, his frail legs shaking violently like brittle twigs caught in a winter gale. Sweat dripped from the boy's dark forehead, soaking the collar of his cotton shirt while his knuckles turned ghostly pale around the rubber grips. The room hung in suffocating silence. Malik Thornfield stood frozen in the doorway, his bespoke charcoal overcoat hanging open, his leather briefcase already dropped upon the rug, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of primitive rage and paralyzing dread. He truly believed he was watching his only child being broken beyond repair. What the world saw on the front page of the Wall Street Journal was a titan of logistics, a self-made black billionaire commanding Vanguard Nexus across 4 continents. What nobody saw was the hollow shell of a man who had not slept more than 3 consecutive hours in over 2,000 days. Every night at precisely 3:42 a.m., Malik would sit at his obsidian desk on the 44th floor of his Chicago headquarters, staring down at the icy dark waters of Lake Michigan with a crystal glass of untouched bourbon warming in his grip. His financial spreadsheets showed an undisputed net worth of $5.2 billion, yet those clean figures felt like ash in his mouth whenever his mind wandered back to his roots. He could never erase the memory of the damp basement apartment in Chatham, where 30 years ago his mother had passed away on a stained vinyl mattress because he could not produce $3,400 for her emergency heart surgery. He had conquered the corporate world to defeat powerlessness. He had accumulated a fortune only to discover that destiny could rob him just as easily in a 20-room mansion as in a neglected tenement. The true fracture in his life had occurred 7 years prior, within the sterile white walls of an emergency delivery suite. His wife, Nia, had slipped away due to sudden obstetrical hemorrhaging exactly 8 minutes after giving birth to their firstborn son. When private pediatric specialists delivered a catastrophic diagnosis barely 90 days later, claiming Tariq suffered from an incurable congenital motor neuropathy that would permanently sever his voluntary mobility, Malik felt a dark curse settle over his existence. He convinced himself that his ruthless corporate climb had extracted a cosmic toll, leaving his innocent boy to bear the physical punishment for his ambitions. Unable to look into his son's eyes without seeing the ghost of the woman he had failed to save, Malik surrendered the boy's entire daily care to Hortense Sterling, a rigid estate administrator who enforced medical isolation with absolute bureaucratic cruelty. He buried his agony beneath corporate mergers and 12-hour flights. He turned his grief into a fortress of absolute avoidance. 10 miles away, in a drafty 410-square-foot studio flat on 79th Street, Dr. Kendra Washington lived on $19.25 an hour. Her dark skin possessed a deep, luminous tone that commanded attention even in the faded denim scrubs she wore every single morning. For 8 years, she had served as the leading pediatric mobility specialist at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, guiding dozens of severely injured children back onto their feet through unorthodox biomechanical therapy. That distinguished career was obliterated within 48 hours when she refused to falsify rehabilitation billing for a corrupt clinic director, choosing to forfeit her professional medical license rather than compromise her integrity. She had subsequently emptied her $48,000 life savings to care for her younger sister through terminal illness, leaving her without a dime, a safety net, or a resume she could publicly present. She took the low-wage caretaking position at the Thornfield estate because she was facing an immediate eviction notice. She brought nothing with her except quiet dignity and an unshakable moral compass. On her 4th morning within the cold, echoing walls of the Lake Forest estate, Kendra observed something that made her pulse race with professional outrage. While administering the boy's routine sponge bath at 7:45 a.m., she discreetly drew the blunt metal edge of an examination pen across the plantar surface of Tariq's left foot. The boy's toes flared outward and instantly flexed downward in a sharp, definitive neuromuscular response. His quadriceps were visibly wasted after years of total confinement, but the deep patellar tendons still possessed profound latent vitality. There was no degeneration in the primary motor pathways. There was no irreversible spinal trauma recorded anywhere in his physical reflexes. What Tariq Thornfield suffered from was severe disuse atrophy, systematically engineered by 6 years of enforced immobility, daily doses of chemical sedatives, and a catastrophic misdiagnosis that no one in the household had ever dared to challenge. Kendra understood immediately that confronting Hortense Sterling directly would only result in her immediate termination and permanent expulsion from the grounds. Hortense walked the estate like an imperial guard, clutching her leather itinerary and ensuring that Tariq remained strapped into his motorized titanium wheelchair 24 hours a day. The administrator received full discretionary authority over the domestic staff, enforcing Dr. Julian Prescott's obsolete medical protocols with an iron grip and zero tolerance for deviation. Kendra knew she was playing with fire. If she attempted unauthorized rehabilitation and failed, she would face criminal charges for practicing medicine without a license and reckless endangerment of a minor. Yet every time she looked at the young boy tracing intricate diagrams of lunar rockets in his notebook, her conscience refused to let her walk away. She spent 3 long weeks mapping out every single movement of the domestic staff, calculating the exact 75-minute window when Hortense left the premises for inventory procurement. On that fateful Tuesday afternoon, as the grandfather clock in the gallery struck 1:15 p.m., Kendra turned the brass deadbolt inside the private conservatory library. She pushed the heavy velvet settee against the oak wainscoting, clearing a 15-foot strip across the thick wool rug. Tariq sat in his motorized chair near the glass wall, clutching his late grandmother's vintage mechanical stopwatch with trembling fingers, his dark eyes wide with terror and sudden disbelief. Kendra knelt directly before him, placing her dark palms flat against the sides of his cold, underdeveloped knees, refusing to look away from his frightened gaze. She did not offer him empty platitudes or false comfort. She spoke to him with the fierce, demanding respect that one warrior gives to another on the eve of battle. "Today we end the lie, Tariq. You are going to stand up and walk to me." The boy stared down at his useless limbs, his small chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths as tears began to carve tracks down his cheeks. For 6 years, he had been conditioned to believe that any attempt to support his own weight would cause his bones to fracture and his nervous system to collapse entirely. Kendra stood up, planted her boots firmly on the floor, and extended her arms out toward him like an unbreakable bridge of iron. Tariq gripped the lightweight crutches she had smuggled into the library 2 days earlier, his slender arms shaking violently as he forced his feet to touch the solid ground for the first time in his conscious memory. Outside, the black Mercedes of Malik Thornfield pulled into the driveway 5 hours earlier than scheduled, the tires crunching over the fresh gravel with menacing speed. Inside the locked conservatory, a child took his first agonizing step into the light. Malik surged across the threshold like an apex predator defending its territory, his long strides eating up the distance between the arched entrance and the center of the conservatory. His tailored wool coat flared behind him as he gripped Kendra by the shoulder, his large fingers digging deep into the coarse fabric of her denim uniform before flinging her violently away from the child. The force sent her skidding backward across the damp stone tiles, her hip striking the heavy mahogany credenza with a dull, sickening thud. She did not cry out. She rose instantly to her feet, her spine perfectly straight and her dark face calm despite the throbbing ache radiating through her side. Tariq lost his balance the instant her support vanished, the aluminum crutches slipping from his sweat-slicked palms and clattering loudly against the limestone floor. The boy collapsed forward in terror, but before his face could strike the hard ground, Malik caught him in his arms, pulling the small, shaking body tightly against his chest with a desperate, suffocating ferocity. "Are you insane?" Malik's voice shook with a rage so visceral that the crystal pendants of the chandelier above seemed to vibrate with the sound. "He has severe degenerative motor dystrophy, a condition documented by the finest pediatric neurologists in this state for over half a decade. Every movement accelerates the degradation of his spinal nerve endings, yet you dare drag him out of his chair like an animal for your amusement." His chest heaved beneath his Italian silk tie, his eyes bloodshot and dilated with an agonizing terror that masked his fury. He looked at Kendra not merely as a negligent employee, but as an executioner sent to strip away the last living fragment of his family. The scent of rain and cold winter air clinging to his overcoat mixed with the sterile aroma of the medicinal ointments that constantly coated the boy's limbs. He felt Tariq's tiny ribcage vibrating with frantic, shallow gasps against his own chest, and the sensation dragged him straight back to the night Nia's heart had ceased beating in the ICU. Kendra took one deliberate step forward, her dark skin glistening faintly under the conservatory's skylights, refusing to drop her gaze beneath the billionaire's murderous glare. Her voice emerged low, measured, and stripped of all subservience, cutting through his frantic shouting like a surgical blade slicing through diseased tissue. Your son does not have a degenerative illness, Mr. Thornfield, nor has he ever suffered from irreversible neuropathy. He has severe secondary disuse atrophy caused by 2,190 days of manufactured paralysis, forced chemical sedation, and a household that prefers a compliant patient over a living child. She pointed an unwavering finger toward the titanium wheelchair parked by the window, its custom restraints gleaming under the gray afternoon sky. Look at his deep tendon reflexes. Look at his bilateral muscle response when stimulated without your prescribed muscle relaxants, and tell me if a dying nerve pathway produces voluntary motor resistance. Shut your, Malik bellowed, stepping directly into her personal space until he stood barely 2 inches from her face, his imposing 6'3" frame towering over her. You are an uncredentialed $19 an hour carer, hired to change bed linens and assist with routine hygiene tasks. You possess neither the medical doctorate nor the institutional standing to question Dr. Julian Prescott, a man who has overseen this family's health for 7 consecutive years. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his black leather wallet with shaking hands, and withdrew a thick stack of $100 bills, thrusting them violently toward her chest. Take your money, pack your bags, and get off my property before I have Lake Forest private security drag you out in handcuffs. The crisp banknotes fluttered to the stone floor, scattering around their boots like dead autumn leaves. Kendra did not look down at the currency. She kept her eyes locked onto his, her expression hardened into pure impenetrable stone. No, Dad! Stop it! The high, cracked scream shattered the suffocating tension in the room. Malik turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat as his arms instinctively reached out to shield the boy on the floor. Tariq had dragged himself across the Persian rug, using only the raw strength of his slender forearms, his dark knees scraping against the rough wool as he grasped the fallen aluminum crutches. With an agonizing, trembling effort that made the veins along his neck bulge with strain, the 7-year-old child jammed the rubber tips of the supports into the limestone floor and pulled his body upward. His legs shook like wet paper under the crushing pressure of his own weight. His face was soaked in tears and sweat, contorted in a grimace of sheer unyielding agony, but he refused to collapse back onto the ground. He stood entirely on his own feet for the first time in 6 years, his posture precarious, his balance wavering, yet undeniably upright before the man who had avoided him for an entire lifetime. Look at me, Dad, Tariq sobbed, his voice breaking into raw, breathless gasps that tore through the silent conservatory. Look at what Kendra helped me do. I took 4 steps yesterday, and I can take 4 more right now if you just watch me. He took one agonizing step forward, his left foot dragging slightly before planting itself firmly upon the stone with a soft, definitive slap. I'm not broken, Dad. I'm not a curse. I worked every single afternoon because I thought if I learned how to run like the other boys at the park, you wouldn't be afraid to look at me anymore. He took a second trembling step, his small knuckles white as bone around the aluminum handles, his tear-filled eyes locked onto his father's frozen face. Please don't send her away. Please don't make me go back into the dark room. The world seemed to stop spinning on its axis for Malik Thornfield. The air left his lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp as the invisible walls of his $5 billion fortress dissolved into absolute nothingness. He did not see a corporate heir or a tragic medical casualty standing before him. He saw his mother, 30 years prior, dragging her failing body toward the sewing machine in their freezing Chatham flat, forcing herself to work through cardiac spasms just so he could have bus fare for school. The memory struck him with the force of an avalanche, tearing through the scar tissue of his carefully constructed emotional exile. His mother had fought until her heart burst because no one cared enough to give her a chance. His son had spent 6 years imprisoned in a mechanical chair because his own father had been too cowardly to face his grief. Malik's knees buckled beneath him. The titan of Vanguard Nexus, the man who commanded thousands of employees and dictated terms to international conglomerates, collapsed onto the hard limestone floor before his child. He did not weep silently. He broke down in deep convulsive sobs that racked his broad shoulders and tore raw, guttural sounds from his throat. He wrapped his arms around Tarek's waist, burying his face into the boy's small stomach, while his large, powerful hands gripped the child's trembling calves. He felt the faint, unmistakable pulse of live muscle fibers working beneath the thin skin, firing in desperate coordination to keep the small body balanced. "I am sorry." Malik choked out through a flood of hot tears, his voice stripped of every trace of pride, power, and authority. "I am so sorry, Tariq. I thought I was protecting you from the world, but I was only running from my own pathetic fear." He pulled the child down gently onto his lap, rocking him back and forth on the floor as the boy's aluminum crutches fell aside, their tears mingling together in the quiet light of the fading afternoon. Kendra stood 5 paces back, her arms crossed over her chest, watching the father and son with a gaze that held both deep sorrow and absolute vindication. She made no move to collect the money scattered across the floor, nor did she utter a single word of triumph or false sympathy. She knew that the true battle had only just begun. When Malik finally raised his head, his dark eyes were red and swollen, the harsh mask of the billionaire stripped away to reveal a man staring into an abyss of profound guilt. "How could this happen?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and raw as he looked at Kendra across the room. Julian Prescott has served as the head of pediatric neurology at one of the most prestigious research clinics in the Midwest for 20 years. Every report, every blood panel, every functional motor assessment he delivered to my desk confirmed that Tariq's spinal pathways were dying. "Because you never read the original raw telemetry files, Mr. Thornfield," Kendra replied with icy clarity, stepping forward until she stood directly over the scattered banknotes. "You read the executive summaries curated by Hortense Sterling, while Dr. Prescott collected $14,000 a month in private retainer fees to never set foot in this mansion for a full hands-on clinical evaluation." She knelt beside them, her dark hands resting gently on Tariq's back, her touch firm, professional, and reassuring. "Give me 7 days of unhindered access without Hortense's interference, without Dr. Prescott's chemical cocktails, and with a certified independent neuromuscular team of my choosing. If I do not prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt that your son can walk out of this estate on his own feet within 6 months, you may personally hand me over to the state authorities." Malik looked from Kendra's unyielding, resolute eyes down to his son, who was clinging to his lapels with small, desperate fists. A cold, dangerous clarity began to replace the chaotic grief in his mind. The sharp instincts of the street kid from Chatham awakening beneath the veneer of corporate respectability. He realized that the greatest threat to his family had not been the outside world, but the very system he had paid millions to construct within his own home. He stood up slowly, lifting Tariq into his arms with a firm, protective hold, and turned toward the heavy mahogany doors that led back into the main house. Outside the conservatory windows, the headlights of Hortense Sterling's town car swept across the circular driveway, signaling the administrator's return. Malik tightened his grip on his son's shoulder, his jaw setting like a vice as he prepared to dismantle the 6-year lie from the inside out. The grandfather clock in the central gallery struck 8:15 p.m., with a heavy metallic resonance that echoed through the vast, empty corridors of the Lake Forest estate. In the private study on the second floor, a fire crackled inside the imported limestone hearth, casting long amber flickers across shelves lined with leather-bound volumes and pristine architectural awards. Malik Thornfield sat behind his massive mahogany desk, the collar of his tailored shirt unbuttoned and his dark face shadowed with exhaustion. Before him lay a black leather checkbook and a fountain pen with an 18-karat gold nib. He had not touched the glass of water sitting beside his laptop. His mind felt like a war zone of conflicting emotions, torn between the visceral memory of his son standing on trembling legs and the terrifying realization of his own complicity in Tariq's confinement. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the clatter of the aluminum crutches on the stone floor. He felt the phantom weight of his child's tear-soaked cheek against his neck. A soft, deliberate knock broke the oppressive silence of the room. Kendra Washington stepped inside, her dark silhouette framed by the warm glow of the hallway sconces. She had changed out of her torn work shirt into a clean, faded navy sweater, her dark skin radiating a quiet, unyielding poise that refused to bend to the luxury surrounding her. She did not advance toward the desk until Malik gestured toward the leather armchair opposite him. She chose to remain standing. Her hands rested loosely at her sides, her posture straight as an iron rod, her dark eyes meeting his with the clinical detachment of a veteran physician entering a consultation. The air between them was dense with unsaid words and lingering hostility. Malik picked up the fountain pen, scribbled a rapid series of strokes across the paper, and tore the check from the binding with a crisp, decisive snap. $60,000, Malik said, his voice deep, gravelly, and stripped of its usual boardroom arrogance as he pushed the slip of paper across the polished wood. That covers 3 full years of your current wage, plus an immediate retainer for your silence regarding the events in the conservatory this afternoon. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed her face for any flicker of greed or relief. I am not a fool, Miss Washington. I know you sacrificed your credentials to protect your sister, and I know your current bank account balance sits below $140. He placed his large, scarred hands flat upon the desk, his jaw tightening with the defensive instinct of a man accustomed to settling every human dispute with financial leverage. Take the money, clear your debts, and accept this as compensation for my rough handling earlier today. Kendra looked down at the check. The crisp paper sat between them like an insult, the neat black ink bearing a figure that could have paid off her back rent, restored her vehicle, and bought 6 months of peace in her drafty apartment. She did not reach out to touch it. Her expression did not shift by a fraction of a millimeter. Instead, she lifted her chin, her dark eyes flashing with a cold, piercing dignity that made the billionaire feel suddenly and acutely naked beneath his wealth. She took a single slow step forward, placed the tip of her index finger against the edge of the check, and slid it smoothly back across the mahogany until it touched the base of his laptop. You still do not understand what is happening in your own home, Mr. Thornfield, Kendra spoke, her voice low, crystalline, and vibrating with absolute moral clarity. You believe every human soul carries a price tag that can be written off in your quarterly balance sheet to soothe your guilty conscience. She locked her gaze onto his bloodshot eyes, refusing to soften the blow. I did not risk a prison sentence and private security violence this afternoon for $60,000 of your guilt money. I did it because your son is a human being with a brilliant mind and living nerve pathways, who was being systematically poisoned by neglect while you hid behind corporate acquisitions. She paused, letting the silence crush the space between them. I do not accept charity, and I do not sell my professional integrity to billionaires who are too cowardly to be fathers. The words struck Malik like a physical lash across the face. In 22 years of corporate warfare, no board member, rival executive, or political figure had ever dared speak to him with such raw, unfiltered disdain. His natural instinct was to summon security and have her removed from the property within 90 seconds. Yet, as he looked at her unyielding stance, the anger died in his throat, replaced by a sudden devastating sense of shame that cut straight to his core. He saw in her the exact same unshakable pride that had defined his late mother, a woman who had scrubbed floors 12 hours a day with swollen hands but had thrown an inspector out of their home for offering pity instead of wages. Malik lowered his head, staring at the check on his desk. The piece of paper felt worthless, a pathetic symbol of his failed attempt to buy redemption. I have not held my son for more than 5 minutes at a time since the day his mother was buried, Malik confessed, his voice barely rising above a whisper as he buried his face in his hands. Every time I looked at him in that mechanical chair, I saw Nia's death, I saw my own failure, and I saw a punishment from God for leaving Chatham behind. He dragged his palms down his face, looking up at her with raw, bloodshot eyes that pleaded for answers rather than dominance. If what you say is true, if Julian Prescott and Hortense have kept him crippled for 6 years, then I am the monster who funded his imprisonment. He pushed the checkbook aside, his hands trembling slightly against the desktop. Tell me what you need to fix this, and I will give you whatever authority you require. I do not want your money, Mr. Thornfield. I want your presence, Kendra answered firmly, stepping closer to the desk and placing both hands flat upon the dark surface. Tariq does not need an absentee benefactor funding state-of-the-art machines. He needs a father who is willing to sweat, bleed, and struggle alongside him on the floor. She pulled a folded document from her pocket, its pages filled with precise hand-drawn anatomical diagrams and daily biomechanical milestones. We begin tomorrow morning at precisely 5:30 a.m., before your corporate workday begins. You will personally assist in his neuromuscular resistance drills. You will hold his harness during gait training, and you will witness every ounce of pain he endures to rebuild what your neglect destroyed." She looked directly into his eyes, sealing the terms of their agreement. No special privileges, no boardroom interference, and no running away when the child screams in agony from muscle fatigue. "If you agree to those conditions, I will lead his rehabilitation." "We have a deal," Malik said, extending his right hand across the desk with solemn, unyielding resolve. Kendra reached out and took his hand, her grip firm, calloused, and equal to his own in strength and determination. For the first time in 6 years, a contract was forged in that room based not on profit margins, but on the sacred reclamation of a child's future. Downstairs, in the shadowed corridor of the West Wing, the door to the administrative suite clicked softly shut. Hortense Sterling stood beside her rosewood writing desk, the receiver of her encrypted landline pressed tightly to her ear, her face pale with cold, venomous calculation. She held a leather-bound ledger containing 6 years of duplicate billing statements, where monthly disbursements of $14,000 had been divided with clinical precision between her personal offshore account and Dr. Julian Prescott's private research foundation. She had observed the entire confrontation in the conservatory through the hidden security feed on her monitor. She had seen the boy take those impossible steps. She knew with absolute certainty that if an independent medical panel examined Tariq Thornfield under neutral clinical conditions, her entire empire of deceit, embezzlement, and systematic eldercare fraud would collapse into a 20-year federal prison sentence. "Julian," Hortense whispered into the receiver, her voice sharp as broken glass and dripping with panic. "The carer managed to get the boy on his feet this afternoon, and Malik was home early to see it with his own eyes." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line, followed by the dry, clinical sigh of Dr. Julian Prescott. "Has Malik contacted the State Neurological Registry or requested the raw imaging files from our central server?" "Not yet," Hortense pacing across the hardwood floor with agitated, predatory steps. "He is emotional, confused, and listening to that unlicensed woman like she is a savior. But he has placed her in charge of the child's schedule starting tomorrow morning." She tightened her grip on the receiver until her knuckles turned white. "If they run a standard electromyography test on his lower limbs, our entire 6-year baseline will be exposed as fraudulent within 48 hours. Then we ensure that test never takes place," Prescott replied, his tone chillingly calm, calculating, and ruthless. "I am drafting an emergency petition to the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services tonight, citing unauthorized, high-risk physical experimentation on a minor with documented spinal instability." A cold chuckle came through the wire. "By noon tomorrow, state child protective officers and Lake Forest police will arrive at the estate with a court order to remove the carer and place the boy under immediate state clinical custody. Let us see how long Malik's newfound conscience lasts when he is facing a public felony indictment for child endangerment." Hortense smiled, a cruel, satisfied smirk curving her lips as she hung up the phone. Outside the mansion, the winter snow fell silently over the dark waters of Lake Forest, blanketing the grounds in a deceptive layer of pristine white. Inside, the battle lines were drawn for a conflict that would either liberate a child or destroy everyone who dared to stand in defense of the truth. The morning frost clung to the eastern windows of the private gymnasium at 5:30 a.m., transforming the glass into sheets of jagged crystalline ice. Malik Thornfield stood on the rubber training mats in a sweat-drenched gray pullover, his large hands trembling as he supported his son by a heavy canvas gait harness. For 7 consecutive days, the billionaire had canceled every morning corporate briefing at Vanguard Nexus, trading his customized suits and board meetings for the grueling, repetitive grind of pediatric motor retraining. Beside them, Kendra Washington knelt on the mat, her dark face set with fierce concentration as her calloused fingers manually guided Tariq's right ankle through a full plantar dorsiflexion sequence. Tariq wept openly from the burning agony in his underdeveloped quadriceps, the sweat dripping from his chin onto the blue foam beneath him. Yet every time the boy looked into his father's eyes, he found neither pity nor avoidance, but an unyielding, ferocious belief that gave him the strength to bear the fire in his limbs. The silence of the morning was broken only by the rhythmic counting of the vintage stopwatch and the boy's ragged, determined breaths. By 11:45 a.m., The fragile peace inside the Lake Forest estate was obliterated by the screech of heavy tires against the wet gravel driveway. Two squad cars from the Lake Forest Police Department pulled up alongside a black state sedan bearing the official seal of the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. Hortense Sterling led the procession through the grand foyer with predatory grace, flanked by Dr. Julian Prescott in an immaculate charcoal cashmere overcoat, and two uniformed officers carrying clipboards and leather restraint gear. Prescott carried a thick court injunction, his thin lips pulled back into a clinical, condescending sneer as he pointed toward the western corridor. The administrator had timed the strike with mathematical precision, alerting local press contacts to an alleged domestic crisis involving medical neglect and physical abuse at the home of one of Chicago's most prominent tech titans. We have an emergency custody order executed under Section 34 of the Juvenile Court Act, Dr. Prescott announced with loud, resonant authority as they breached the conservatory doors. We have received sworn testimony indicating that an unlicensed, terminated domestic worker is subjecting Master Tariq Thornfield to dangerous, unauthorized physical experiments that threaten to sever his remaining spinal motor pathways. He presented the stamped judicial document directly toward Malik, his tone dripping with false professional outrage. Mr. Thornfield, your emotional state following the tragedy of your wife has clearly impaired your parental judgment, leaving your vulnerable child exposed to predatory malpractice. Officers, secure the child immediately and place Ms. Washington under arrest for felony child endangerment. The senior officer stepped forward, his hand resting on the leather holster of his sidearm as he produced a pair of steel handcuffs, gesturing for Kendra to turn around and place her hands behind her back. Kendra did not flinch. She stood firmly in front of Tariq's chair, her dark skin gleaming under the fluorescent lights, her posture straight as an iron pillar as she locked her gaze onto Dr. Prescott. Malik stepped directly into the officer's path, his 6'3" frame radiating a lethal, contained menace that forced the armed man to halt in his tracks. The billionaire did not raise his voice. Instead, he pulled a thick, blue-tab dossier from his inner coat pocket and dropped it onto the glass table with a heavy, definitive slap. Before you touch a single person in this room, officer, you will look at the forensic financial audit delivered to my desk at 4:15 this morning, Malik spoke, his deep voice slicing through the conservatory like a scythe. For 72 consecutive months, Dr. Julian Prescott has deposited $14,000 a month from this estate into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Horizon Neurological Consulting. He turned his piercing, bloodshot eyes toward Hortense, who stepped back with a sudden, involuntary gasp of terror. And for 72 consecutive months, Miss Hortense Sterling has received an exact 40% kickback of $5,600 directly into her private offshore account to ensure my son was dosed with chemical sedatives and kept permanently bound to a wheelchair to justify the ongoing medical fraud. That is an outrageous defamatory fabrication. Dr. Prescott hissed, his face turning an ashen gray as he clutched his leather satchel tightly against his chest. I have 20 years of exemplary medical service in this state. That boy is a documented paraplegic who cannot support his own body weight for 3 seconds without sustaining catastrophic structural damage to his skeletal frame. Look at him, he is completely helpless. I am not helpless. The cry came from behind Kendra, high, clear, and vibrating with the unbroken spirit of a child who had found his voice in the fire of adversity. Tariq pushed himself forward, his small hands gripping the armrests of his titanium wheelchair. As he unlocked the mechanical footplates, with a decisive click, the room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The child reached for the pair of lightweight aluminum crutches resting against the wall, his dark face tight with absolute determination. With a deep, shuddering gasp that drew every eye in the room to his fragile form, Tariq swung his legs over the edge, planted his worn rubber-soled sneakers firmly against the cold limestone tiles, and stood completely upright without any adult assistance. The officers gasped in disbelief. The state child welfare inspector let her pen drop to the floor, her mouth open in stunned silence as she stared at the boy who was supposed to be completely paralyzed. Tariq took one deliberate, trembling step forward. His left knee buckled momentarily under the crushing weight, but he caught his balance with the crutches, grinding his teeth in fierce defiance of the pain. He took a second step, then a third, the rubber tips clicking rhythmically against the stone floor. 4 steps, 5 steps, 8 steps. He walked directly toward the terrified, frozen figure of Hortense Sterling, his dark eyes burning with the raw dignity of a survivor confronting his captor. "You told me my legs were dead, Hortense," Tariq spoke, his voice despite the tears streaming down his small cheeks as he stood tall before her. "You gave me the bitter medicine every night at 8 p.m., so I would sleep through the morning and never try to stand up. You told me my dad hated me because I was broken." He took 3 more firm steps, passing right by her shaking form, and continued straight toward the open arms of his father. He took 16 full, uninterrupted steps across the vast conservatory before dropping the aluminum crutches entirely. He fell into Malik's chest with a triumphant, breathless sob, his small arms wrapping around his father's neck with an unbreakable grip. Malik caught his son, falling to his knees on the stone floor, and burying his face in the child's neck while he wept with an overwhelming soul-cleansing gratitude that washed away 6 years of bitter grief. He rose a moment later, holding Tariq securely on his hip, and turned toward the Lake Forest police officers with the cold, absolute authority of a sovereign reclaiming his territory. "Arrest them both," Malik commanded, pointing toward Dr. Prescott and Hortense Sterling. "I have already transferred the duplicate bank ledgers, the raw electromyography scans conducted by Dr. Ben Carter yesterday, and the internal security recordings directly to the state attorney's office. If you do not handcuff them now, my legal team will have you cited for obstruction of justice before noon." The officers did not hesitate. Within 60 seconds, steel handcuffs snapped around the wrists of Dr. Julian Prescott and Hortense Sterling, their arrogant facades crumbling into pathetic, frantic pleas as they were escorted out into the cold winter rain. Malik turned to Kendra Washington, who stood beside the empty wheelchair, with tears glistening upon her dark cheeks. He bowed his head toward her with profound, humble reverence, acknowledging the woman who had risked everything to save his bloodline when he had been too blind to see. The war inside the estate had been won, but the public battle to dismantle the system that enabled such cruelty was about to shake the city of Chicago to its foundations. The morning sun broke over the skyline of downtown Chicago, casting long ribbons of golden warmth across the emerald expanse of Millennium Park. 8 months had passed since the state indictment of Dr. Julian Prescott and the dismantling of the fraudulent medical network that had imprisoned Tariq Thornfield in a mechanical chair for 6 agonizing years. On the open paved plaza near the pavilion, a crowd of hundreds gathered beneath the banners of the newly inaugurated May Thornfield Pediatric Diagnostic Foundation, a $40 million independent clinical institute funded entirely by Vanguard Nexus. The state medical board had fully restored Dr. Kendra Washington's professional license with special commendations, appointing her as chief medical director of the entire nonprofit initiative. She stood near the podium dressed in an elegant ivory blazer, her deep, dark skin glowing in the summer light, her eyes calm and filled with the quiet, unshakable peace of a woman who had fought through the valley of shadow and reclaimed her rightful place in the world. Beside the stage, Malik Thornfield stood watching the ceremony with a gentle, relaxed smile that had erased a decade of chronic exhaustion from his face. For the first time in 30 years, the billionaire felt a profound, sacred stillness inside his chest. The previous evening at 11:14 p.m. he had walked into the quiet third-floor gallery of his Lake Forest home, holding 2 framed photographs against his chest. One of his late mother standing beside her old sewing machine in Chatham, and the other of his late wife, Nia, holding their newborn son moments before her passing. He had placed those pictures side by side on his obsidian desk, lighting a single candle beneath them, and wept not from bitter shame or powerlessness, but from a deep, liberating sense of fulfilled duty. He had realized that while he could never rewrite the poverty of his youth or the tragedy of the delivery room, he had finally honored their memories by choosing to stand up, face the truth, and fight for the living. True wealth was never measured by corporate valuations, but by the courage to be present for the people who relied on your love. A sudden, joyous shout echoed across the pavilion lawn, turning the heads of the photographers and reporters seated near the front row. Tariq was running. He was not using crutches, braces, or holding an adult's hand. He was sprinting across the green grass in a pair of blue running shoes, his dark curls bouncing in the warm wind as he chased a red soccer ball toward the center of the park. There was still a slight hitch in his left stride, a small reminder of the years of muscle wasting he had conquered through sheer discipline, but it was undeniably, gloriously a run. Every step he took across the earth was a living testament to human resilience, defying every fraudulent diagnosis and every limitation imposed upon him by a system of greed and neglect. The young boy kicked the ball cleanly across the turf, laughing with a pure uninhibited joy that rang out like church bells on Sunday morning. Tariq reached the stage, breathless and beaming with sweat-drenched pride, throwing his arms tightly around Kendra's waist before leaping into the strong, open arms of his father. Malik lifted his 7-year-old son high into the air against the Chicago skyline, their laughter mingling together in the bright sunlight as cameras flashed, and the entire crowd rose in a spontaneous, thunderous standing ovation. The boy leaned in close, wrapping his small hands around his father's neck, whispering words that dissolved the last remaining scars of their shared past. "I can touch the stars now, Dad, because you never let me fall." Kendra stepped to the podium, her voice steady, powerful and resonant as it carried across the park and through the broadcast microphones to thousands of viewers across the nation. True healing does not begin in a pharmacy or an executive boardroom. It begins the moment we refuse to look past the suffering of the invisible and choose to see their inherent dignity. No child is born to be a prisoner of another person's fear, and no human life is an acceptable casualty of convenience. When we give people a platform of unyielding truth and demand the best from their spirit, they do not merely survive their circumstances, they rise above them and conquer the impossible. Malik stood beside her, his hand resting gently on his son's shoulder, looking out over the city he had conquered not as an isolated titan hiding behind glass walls, but as a father who had finally found his way home. The true triumph of a human life is not the accumulation of gold in the absence of pain, but the relentless courage to break down the walls of our own making and build a sanctuary where those we love may run free.